It was a quiet Saturday morning. The kind of morning where the world feels a little too peaceful. Almost like it is trying to warn you that something is about to shatter that calm. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto my porch when I noticed a white SUV slowly rolling down the street. The vehicle had the words, HOA Enforcement Units, printed on the side in large block letters. But even from a distance, I could tell the lettering was crooked, like someone had stuck vinyl stickers on in a hurry. I watched the SUV creep toward my house before coming to a dramatic stop right in front of my driveway. Two men stepped out. Both were wearing dark navy uniforms with shiny badges that looked suspiciously cheap, like something from a costume store. One had a plastic-looking walkie-talkie clipped to his belt that wasn't even turned on. The other wore sunglasses even though the sky was completely overcast. The moment they stepped onto my driveway, I knew something was wrong. The taller ones, who seemed to be acting like he was in charge, walked right up to me with a clipboard and said in a stiff, rehearsed tone, "Sir, we are with the Homeowner Association Police, and you are under investigation for multiple violations of community conduct." I almost laughed, but I kept my face straight. I had lived in that neighborhood for 4 years, attended multiple HOA meetings, and not once in my life had I heard of an HOA Police. Usually, the biggest enforcement they could do was send strongly worded emails and threaten fines about trash cans being visible from the street. But these guys wanted to act like they were running a full-blown investigation. I took a slow sip of my coffee and asked, "And what exactly am I being investigated for?" The man flipped through his blank clipboard sheets with the intensity of someone trying to act important. "You have violated Section 4A, unauthorized driveway use, Section 6B, property appearance negligence, and Section 9F, suspicious activity on the premises." I stared at him, then looked at my driveway, which was spotless, my lawns, which was perfectly trimmed, and my porch, which had nothing on it except my mug. "Suspicious activity," I repeated. "What exactly counts as suspicious?" The man cleared his throat, readjusted his sunglasses, and snapped, "We cannot disclose that information due to ongoing investigations." At this point, my suspicion turned into amusement. They were clearly trying to intimidate me, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. What they didn't know was that I wasn't some randomly scared resident who would panic at the word violations. I was a federal agent, an active FBI agent, currently enjoying my first free weekend in months. But I didn't tell them that yet. Instead, I leaned casually against my porch railing and asked, "So why exactly are you here?" "Because this all seems a little theatrical." The shorter man stepped forward, puffing out his chest like a rooster trying to look dangerous. "We have received a direct order from the HOA board to detain you for questioning regarding your noncompliance." "Detain me?" I repeated slowly. "You're saying you, as HOA Police, are going to detain me?" He nodded seriously and rested a hand on what looked like a holster, except there was nothing in it. I could feel the absurdity rising like a bubble inside me. They were expecting fear, but all I could think about was how ridiculous they looked standing there pretending to be officers. I took another long sip of coffee and responded, "All right then, show me your credentials." You'd think I had asked them to solve quantum physics. The taller one stuttered, reached into his pocket, and pulled out an ID badge printed on what looked like standard printer paper. It didn't even have a hologram, watermark, or anything remotely official. Just a picture of him, his name in Comic Sans font, and the words, HOA Police Enforcement Division. I stared at the badge for 3 seconds, then handed it back before I burst out laughing. "Okay," I said, wiping a tear from my eye. "Try again. Real credentials." The men exchanged a nervous glance. The shorter one pulled out his phone and waved it in front of me. "We have digital credentials too," he said. The screen was black. He hadn't even unlocked the phone. At this point, I knew I wasn't dealing with pranksters. These guys were serious. They genuinely believed they had the right to arrest homeowners. The tall ones, clearly offended, straightened his shoulders and said, "Sir, if you do not cooperate, we will be forced to escalate this situation." Now I was intrigued. Escalated how? I asked calmly. He pointed to their SUV. "We have authority to transport non-compliant residents to the HOA facility for processing." An HOA facility? What was that someone's garage? I was done playing along. My patience evaporated, and my training kicked in. I set my coffee cup down slowly, making sure not to show even a hint of aggression. "Gentlemen," I said, "before you do anything else, I need to ask you one simple question." They both stared at me, probably expecting me to beg. "Are you absolutely sure you want to continue this?" They didn't understand the warning. The shorter one smirked and said, "We re more than sure. You re coming with us." That was the moment I decided the game was over. They had made the first move, but they had no idea a storm was about to hit them. The moment they insisted they were going to take me in, the situation shifted from absurd to downright comedic. It was like watching two kids role-playing as cops without realizing how completely out of their depth they were. But despite how ridiculous they looked, there was something darker beneath their behavior and arrogance that came from thinking they had unchecked authority. Fake authority, but authority nonetheless. And I could tell they'd probably bullied more than a few neighbors with it. The tall one cleared his throat dramatically and said, "We are placing you under community arrest for repeated violations and failure to comply with HOA mandates." He said the words slowly, as if hoping it would make them sound official. I folded my arms and said, "All right, let us hear these violations again. This time, with actual explanations." He opened his clipboard, still blank pages, and held it up like he was reading from it. "First violation," he announced, "unauthorized driveway use." I raised an eyebrow. "Explain." The shorter one immediately jumped in, eager to sound tough. "Your car was parked at an angle last week. It disrupted the visual symmetry of the block." I paused, staring at him as my brain processed the stupidity. "You mean?" I parked slightly to the right. He nodded proudly. "Yes. That is unacceptable under Section 4A. Second violation." The tall one continued. "Property negligence. Your porch light was off on Tuesday evening." I almost choked. It was off because the bulb burned out. I replaced it the next morning. The man shook his head. "Doesn't matter. A violation is a violation." I couldn't help smiling. Not a friendly smile, one of those slow, sarcastic smiles that means, "You guys have no idea how badly you're messing up right now." But the third violation was the one that sealed it. The tall one puffed his chest and declared, "Suspicious activity." The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. I stared at him, waiting for the punchlines. "What suspicious activity?" I asked. His answer almost sent me into hysterics. "We observed you carrying a black duffel bag into your house late at night." I blinked. "You mean my gym bag?" He lowered his sunglasses slightly, trying to look intimidating. "We cannot verify that." I pressed my lips together, fighting a laugh. It had a giant Nike logo on it. "Logos can be faked," he replied with confidence. I swear I felt brain cells dying listening to this man talk. This wasn't enforcement, it was delusion mixed with a little power trip. They weren't concerned about safety. They weren't concerned about rules. They wanted control. Vague, flimsy, imaginary control, but enough to feed their ego. And I could see it in how they carried themselves. How they tried to tower over me. How they believed raising their voice equaled authority. The shorter one kept stepping closer, trying to get into my personal space. "You reacting very defensive," he said smugly. "Only guilty people act this defensive." I leaned back on my porch railing and replied, "I am acting patient. There's a difference." He smirked like he won something. "Your tone is hostile." That is another violation, section 11D. Hostile tone. I repeated. Is that defined anywhere? We decide what is hostile. He said, tapping his empty holster. It's discretionary. It was surreal. Two untrained, delusional men were trying to intimidate someone who had gone through federal tactical training, interrogation training, and crisis response training. Men who didn't even know how to properly stand like real officers. Men whose badges could be printed at a kindergarten craft table. The tall one walked around to my side yard and pointed at a perfectly trimmed piece of lawn. This grass is half an inch above regulated height. I looked at the grass, then at him. It was cut yesterday. He shook his head. Not to HOA standards. And what standards are those? I asked. He responded, whatever we deem necessary for community consistency. I let out a slow exhale. So you just make the rules up. He didn't hesitate. Yes. That's why we in charge. That was the moment my patience evaporated. Not because of the stupidity, they had shown plenty of that already, but because their arrogance made one thing clear. They had done this to other residents. People who didn't know their rights. People who probably got scared when these two clowns showed up pretending to be officers. People who were bullied into paying fake fines or letting themselves be intimidated. I analyzed the situation calmly. Fake uniforms, fake badges, fake authority but real confidence. Meaning they'd gotten away with it before. Meaning someone was backing them. Or paying them. The shorter one stepped forward. Final chance, he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs so cheap the metal was flaking off. Comply with us now, or we escalate to detention procedures per section 15A. Detention procedures. I asked slowly, what exactly does that mean? The tall one answered proudly. We place you in the vehicle, transport you to the HOA holding facility, and process your violations. Where is this facility? I asked, fully aware there was no such thing. Confidential. He replied, classified HOA property. That was the last straw. For the first time since they arrived, I let the weight of my real authority slip into my voice. Gentlemen, I said calmly, before you take another step, think very carefully about what you're redoing. They both smiled like wolves. We know exactly what we're redoing. The tall one said, and we were not afraid to take action. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that they were about 30 seconds away from the biggest mistake of their lives. Because their ridiculous accusations weren't just annoying, they were about to become federal crimes. The two fake officers had absolutely no idea how far they were pushing it. They were still standing there, chests puffed out, rattling their cheap handcuffs like toys, convinced they were about to drag me off to whatever imaginary HOA holding facility they claimed existed. I watched them take a step closer to me, and although their uniforms were laughable, their intent was getting more serious. This was no harmless prank. These two genuinely believed they were carrying out some kind of enforcement. That meant they weren't just idiots, they were dangerous idiots. And dangerous idiots with fake authority can cause real harm. I let the silence stretch for a moment, not saying a word, letting them stew in their own confidence. The tall one took my silence as a sign of intimidation. We'll give you 5 seconds to comply, he said, raising his chin like a movie villain. After that, we escalate. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply watched them. The shorter one started counting out loud with exaggerated pauses between each number. 1, 2, listen. It's easier if you just come quietly. 3. I decided to speak before he got to 4. All right, I said slowly, calmly. Let me get something. Their posture shifted immediately. They thought they had won. The shorter one smirked. Good choice, sir. You remaking this easier on yourself. I turned and walked inside my house without closing the door behind me. If they thought about rushing in after me, they didn't. probably because they were scared or unsure of their own script. Inside, I went straight to a drawer in my foyer where I kept my credentials. I took a moment to breathe, not because I was nervous, but because I had to mentally prepare for their reaction. Some people crumble when they realize they're in trouble. Others panic. But occasionally, you find the special ones, the ones who double down, even when their world starts collapsing. I had a feeling these two would be that type. I stepped back outside holding my wallet with my badge inside. They were waiting for me at the doors, their fake posture back in place. Hands where we can see them. The tall one ordered, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. I ignored him. I stood on the porch, opened my wallet, and held my real federal badge right in front of them. Their expressions didn't change at first. They squinted like they were inspecting something unfamiliar. Then their faces froze. The tall one's mouth twitched slightly, like he was trying to swallow a sudden wave of panic. The shorter one leaned in closer, squinting at the badge like he hoped staring at it long enough would make it fake. "What? What is that?" he asked, his voice cracking at the end. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten them. I simply stated the truth with absolute clarity. I am a federal agent. FBI. The shorter one took a small step back. No. No. No way. He stammered. The FBI doesn't live in neighborhoods like this. I raised an eyebrow. We live everywhere. The tall one looked like he was trying to maintain control, but his confidence was leaking out of him like air from a punctured balloon. This doesn't change anything. He stuttered. You're still under HOA arrest. I couldn't help it this time. I actually laughed. Loudly. HOA arrest. Do you even hear yourselves? They exchanged a panicked glance. The shorter one started looking around, scanning the neighborhood like he expected someone to jump out and save him. You could have just told us, he said weakly. We're just doing our job. I snapped my wallet shut. You don't have a job, I said flatly. There is no HOA Police Department. That badge you're wearing is counterfeit. Your uniforms are fake. Your vehicle markings are illegal. And trying to detain me, that's kidnapping. The tall one visibly swallowed. We reauthorized by the board, he muttered, but there was no conviction left in his voice. I took a slow step toward them. Not aggressively, just enough to show I wasn't playing anymore. Then you won't mind if I call in your information to the real authorities. We'll see how the board feels when they re-investigated for impersonating law enforcement. Panic flashed across both of their faces now. The tall one lifted a hand slightly, as if trying to calm the situation, but he couldn't stop his fingers from trembling. Let us slow down, he said. There's no need to involve anyone else. I almost smiled. There was no need for you to come here pretending to arrest me. But here we are. The shorter one suddenly blurted. We didn't know you were FBI. As if that somehow made their actions less criminal. I responded. You don't have to know someone's job before deciding not to impersonate officers. They froze again. Then came the moment when the last shred of their fake bravado evaporated. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Not with speed. Not with any intention to scare them, just deliberately. The second they saw the phone, they panicked like animals cornered by a predator. The shorter one immediately said, "Okay, wait, hold on, don't call anyone, we can fix this." The tall one added, "This was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding where you tried to kidnap me." I asked calmly, "Is that your final version of the story?" No, look. We didn't means. Enough, I said sharply, and they both shut up instantly. You two made a mistake. A big mistake. And I guarantee you have no idea how much trouble you're in. The tall one's eyes darted toward their SUV. I could practically see the thought forming in his mind. Don't even think about running, I said. If you get in that car, you're adding evasion to your list of crimes. They froze. Completely. The power dynamic had flipped so fast they couldn't keep up. And finally, after all the arrogance, the fake authority, the nonsense accusations, they understood the truth. They had walked straight into a federal agent's home, pretending to be law enforcement, and I wasn't letting them walk away. The moment those two froze on my porch, suddenly realizing they were knee-deep in federal crimes, the entire tone of the neighborhood shifted. I could feel eyes peeking from behind blinds, the eerie stillness that comes when something big is unfolding. But unlike them, I wasn't improvising. I'd done this job long enough to know exactly how to proceed without escalating the situation unnecessarily. I kept my voice controlled, steady, and professional as I instructed them to step back and keep their hands visible. They obeyed instantly. Funny how fast fake authority collapses when faced with real authority. I called the local police first, not because I needed their help, but because jurisdictionally, they had to document impersonation before the federal side got involved. When dispatch heard possible police impersonators attempting unlawful detainment, officers were sent immediately. As we waited, the two stood stiffly, trying not to look terrified, though the shorter one kept whispering things like, "We were so screwed," and "This wasn't supposed to happen." That sentence, "this wasn't supposed to happen," stuck in my mind. It implied plannings. It implied repetition. It implied victims. When the first squad car arrived, the officers approached cautiously, as they should. The tall fake HOA cop started sputtering excuses immediately, talking a mile a minute. We weren't impersonating, we were assigned authority by the HOA. This is a misunderstanding, he's lying, we volunteers. The officer shut him down with a single stern command. Hands on the vehicle. Now, they complied, and the look on their faces said everything. Their performance was over. The real-world consequences were beginning. Once they were secured, I gave my statement, showing my credentials, explaining exactly what happened, and handing over the photos I took of their uniforms and vehicle. I hadn't originally planned to take photos, but the moment they first claimed to be HOA Police, I snapped a few shots discreetly. Years in the FBI teach you that evidence isn't something you gather later, it's something you collect in real time. While the officers questioned them, I noticed one detail that hadn't registered before. Their fake SUV had magnetic decals. Not painted, not professionally applied, just cheap magnets someone could peel off with one hand. That told me this wasn't a high-effort operation. This was low-budget intimidation. The kind people run when they think no one will question them. The police ended up calling their sergeant, who took one look at the setup and immediately called for detectives. When coordination with federal authorities came up, I told them I'd be taking over the deeper investigation alongside them. And that's when the real unraveling began. It took exactly 1 hour for detectives to track the registration of the fake HOA vehicle. It wasn't registered to the HOA at all, it belonged to a woman named Margaret Silverton. The name sounded familiar, and it took me a moment to place it. She was the president of the HOA. And not just the president, the power-hungry, deeply disliked, notoriously controlling head of it. I'd seen her at meetings, barking orders like a drill sergeant. But I had no idea she was involved in something this criminal. I requested a search warrant for her property and HOA office records, and the detectives supported the request with the evidence gathered at the scene. Within a few hours, the green light came through. We headed to the HOA administrative building first, along with local police officers. The moment we stepped in, the entire scheme started collapsing like a house of cards. Inside were stacks of folders labeled with handwritten notes. Violations, non-compliant residents, fine enforcement, monitoring logs. That last one hit me hardest. Monitoring logs. Pages and pages of notes detailing where certain residents parked, how often they left homes, the guests who visited them, even what time they walked their dogs. It wasn't community oversight, it was surveillance. Illegal surveillance. Worse, some logs had the initials of the two fake officers next to them. But then came the real discovery. A locked filing cabinet. After it was forced open, we found envelopes, dozens of them stuffed with cash. Not checks. Not official documents. Cash collected from fines that were never recorded in any official HOA ledger. Residents had been bullied into paying fake penalties. And these two clowns were the enforcers. We also found a box of fake uniforms, multiple sizes, meaning more people might have been involved. Fake badges. Printed citations on cheap paper. A stack of HOA violation tickets, designed to look like real legal documents. And buried at the bottom of that box, we found lists of homes specifically marked as targets for inspection. My house was on the list. This wasn't random. They had planned to come to my home. Whether they targeted me because they thought I'd be scared, or because my home was newer, or because they wanted money, I wasn't sure. But the fact that they were bold enough to send fake officers to my door meant they had done it many times before. And the fact that they didn't check who I was. Amateur-level arrogance. As we kept digging, we found documentation tying everything directly to Margaret, the HOA president. She deauthorized the creation of the Compliance Enforcement Group, which was nothing more than a name she made up to manipulate residents. She'd been using these men to intimidate people into paying made-up fines, threatening legal actions, and even mocking up fake arrest warrants to scare people into submission. The detectives were stunned. "This is extortion," one officer said. "This is organized fraud." Another added, "This is federal." I said quietly, and I meant it. By that afternoon, we had more than enough evidence to issue formal charges not only against the two fake officers, but also against Margaret and anyone else involved in the scheme. And after the arrests began, the stories started pouring out. Residents came forward with tales of threats, harassment, unauthorized entries, and fines that drained their savings. The HOA Police weren't just a joke, they were a full-blown criminal operation masquerading as community rules. And now that it had come to my door, it was going to be dismantled piece by piece. The fallout from the investigation happened faster than anyone in the neighborhood expected. It was like ripping the roof off a termite-infested house once the light hit. Everything that had been quietly rotting underneath became impossible to ignore. The arrests made headlines in the local news within 48 hours. HOA president accused of extortion. Fake officers charged with impersonation. Neighborhood surveillance ring exposed. People were stunned. Some were outraged. Others terrified. And many relieved. But above all, the community was done being silent. Not one resident defended Margaret or her fake enforcement squad. In fact, the flood of complaints that poured in became overwhelming. Elderly residents admitted they paid thousands in fake noise fines. A single mom shared how the fake officers threatened to remove her children if she didn't repaint her house to match the HOA color palette. A retired veteran confessed they showed up at his home at night, demanding he voluntarily surrender his dog because it didn't meet HOA breed policies. None of these policies existed. Every one of them was fabricated. And now, finally, the victims felt safe enough to speak. The two fake officers, whose bravado had evaporated the moment real law enforcement touched them, were suddenly very cooperative. They traded information in hopes of lighter sentences. They revealed how Margaret recruited them, coached them, paid them under the table, and manipulated them into thinking they were doing the community's work. They admitted they were given scripts to follow, phrases to use, and a list of scare tactics designed to intimidate anyone who hesitated. That list included threats of arrest, property seizure, HOA court hearings, and civil penalties, none of which were real. Margaret, on the other hand, refused to talk, even as she was led out of her house in handcuffs. She barked at the cameras, insisting everything was legitimate, claiming she had the right to enforce order, and screaming that the neighborhood would fall apart without strong leadership. Her delusions were almost impressive. Almost. The prosecution built the case quickly, with physical evidence, financial records, testimonies, and recorded threats. The charges stacked up: extortion, impersonation of law enforcement, fraud, harassment, misuse of HOA funds, illegal surveillance, and conspiracy. It was more than enough to destroy her professionally, financially, and socially. When the trial began, the courtroom was full. Residents packed the benches, eager to see justice play out. I attended as well, not because I needed closure, but because it was part of my testimony. The defense tried to paint Margaret as a misunderstood leader, someone who cared deeply about community rules. But that narrative fell apart the moment the prosecutor played recordings of her yelling at residents, ordering fake fines, and threatening to arrest anyone who disrespected her authority. The two fake officers testified too, though their statements did nothing to win sympathy. Their nervous stammering, the way they kept avoiding eye contact, and their painfully detailed admissions of following orders made it clear they knew they were wrong. They just didn't expect to get caught. But the most damning moment came when the prosecutor presented the financial ledgers, showing thousands of dollars of unreported cash collected through fraudulent fines. Each envelope was labeled by address. Each envelope had dates, amounts, and sometimes scribbled notes like, "Scared easily, return next month." "Lord, needs another warning visit." The entire courtroom gasped. Even the judge paused with a look of disgust. When it was finally my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I explained the incident: the fake arrest attempt, the bogus authority claims, the counterfeit uniforms, and the intimidation tactics. I explained how I identified the impersonation immediately. And I made one thing clear: if they were bold enough to attempt this on me, a federal agent, then they would have continued hurting others. Stopping them wasn't just necessary. It was overdue. The courtroom went silent. Even Margaret, who had spent most of the trial glaring, said nothing. The verdict came swiftly. Margaret was found guilty on nearly every charge. She received multiple years in state prison, followed by a heavy restitution order to pay back every resident she had stolen from. Her personal assets were seized, including the HOA office she had essentially turned into a headquarters for her criminal operation. The two fake officers didn't get off easy either. Though they received lighter sentences due to cooperation, they were still convicted of impersonating law enforcement, harassment, and involvement in the extortion scheme. They were banned from any HOA involvement for life, and they left the courtroom in handcuffs, ironically real ones this time. But the aftermath was more than just legal consequences. The neighborhood began rebuilding. Residents formed a new HOA board, one that was transparent, fair, and community-driven. People who had avoided each other out of fear now talked openly. There were block parties, neighborhood cleanups, and meetings where residents were encouraged to speak without being bullied or threatened. Even the news coverage changed the tone. Instead of being known as that neighborhood with the crazy HOA, we earned a reputation for resilience and unity. And ironically, several neighbors thanked me personally for being the one person Margaret didn't check before targeting. As for me, I didn't feel like a hero. I just did what any agent or any decent person would do when faced with abuse of power. But I will admit there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that the fake HOA police, who once stood on my porch with cheap badges and big egos, ended up learning what real justice looks like. And justice, when it finally arrives, has a way of erasing every ounce of fake authority.